So the mark of a good disciple in the first century is to replicate what the rabbi said and what the rabbi did exactly, right? And you can see this. I'm not going to remember his name. There's a scholarly work that demonstrates this. Anyway, the disciples, Jesus' disciples, would have fallen right in line with that tradition. Right? The value was not in Peter or in Paul and who they were, but that they could represent and speak authoritatively about what Jesus did and what Jesus said, right? So there's that instinct, get it right. Secondly, the apostles exerted a kind of control over the oral tradition. If somebody were to travel off to Ephesus and misrepresent Jesus, well, it's not long before an apostle would travel there and straighten out whatever mistakes or misunderstandings there might be. At first, only the apostles did any of the teaching as it is in Jerusalem. Then once they scatter from Jerusalem in Acts 8 and 9, Acts chapter 8, they scatter out of Jerusalem. Then there are less, the apostles can't be everywhere at all times, so they're not preaching in every synagogue. But nonetheless, we know Peter and Paul and all, and they traveled around. And so their presence on the historical stage exercised this kind of control over the oral tradition until Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are written down, again, by apostles when they were still alive. I think that's worth pointing out. Let's talk about Jewish backgrounds. It's a lot that we could discuss here. Why is this important? Well, it's important because one of Christianity's most powerful apologetics is the argument that these things happened in real history, right? Jesus was a real man at one particular time, in one particular place, and there are only a handful of events that he actually did in that time and space. He was a Jewish man born into a Jewish world, and there were Jewish concerns and hopes and fears of the people around him, and he spoke into those. You follow me? Other religions originate with someone in a cave receiving a vision, or in the woods receiving a vision. You understand? There's no historic groundedness to it. Whereas the Jewish faith has always argued that Abraham was a real man called by God to go to a real land, wherever the land is from here. Right? And the Exodus actually happened. They were down in Egypt, and then they came out. The Babylonian exile is a real event, and Jesus lived at a real time in a real world. And so the better that we understand the Jewish backgrounds of Jesus' day, the better we will understand in what way is Jesus the answer to the questions that people have. How is Jesus the solution? You follow me? And we'll also be able to understand the text better itself. So it's written at this time, it's influenced by these times, and to give attention to these things reinforces this important point of Christianity, that this is an historically revealed religion. Okay? So let's start with this. In the 6th century BC, as you know, Babylon, in three waves, assaults Jerusalem. And in those waves, they take back people from Jerusalem, particularly the leading party, the educated class, the leadership class, with them back to Babylon, right? That'd be early 6th century. And then in the late 6th century, Ezra brings the people back, right? But not everybody comes back. Stories like Esther are just one example of how people would stay out in the far-off places of the world. And in this time, the Babylonians are, of course, conquered by the Persians. By the 4th century BC, the Persians are supplanted by the Greeks. And then Alexander's empire when he dies, Alexander the Great, when he dies, his empire is divided into 4 sections. 4 sections. One of those is ruled by a guy named Antiochus. Antiochus IV, sometimes called Antiochus Epiphanes. And here's how the story goes in the 2nd century BC now. So we're 2nd century BC. So we're moving along quickly, right? Antiochus taxed the Jewish people, right? So let me just point this out, though. We'll go back a step. So ever since the early 6th century BC, the Jews are controlled by the Babylons, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and then more Greeks. Antiochus was a Greek. You follow me? So they're always under the control of these foreign oppressors. And Antiochus, he was running out of tax money for some debts that he had and some wars that he had created. And so he travels down. I wish I had a map here, but he travels down from north. Well, I can do this. It's the best I can do. This is the Mediterranean Sea. We'll call that the Promised Land. How does that look? Okay. This is Egypt down here. This is Egypt down here. Right? And Antiochus is up here in his capital. And he comes down through Jerusalem and beyond into Egypt because he wants to start a war with Egypt to capture more treasures. Okay? But when he gets there, he's told that Egypt is actually in alliance with Rome. So we have an alliance. So if you attack me, you're actually attacking Rome. Okay? Now that's less appealing. And so Antiochus turns around and heads home. In the meantime, in Jerusalem, the Jews had revolted. The Jews had believed that if Antiochus goes to fight the Egyptians, he will lose. And so this gave the Jews an opportunity in Jerusalem to revolt against his reign. However, he doesn't engage in battle in Egypt. Antiochus doesn't. So when he comes back home, he has to travel through Jerusalem. You follow me? With his full army. And he's angry. He's embarrassed that he went down to Egypt to fight and he just turned around like a coward. And now he hears that there are people in Jerusalem who are revolting against him. Okay? And so he gives orders to crucify many of the Jewish leaders, to burn all their books, and he himself goes into the holy place, into the sacred of sacred, and sacrifices a pig on the altar. Okay? He knows exactly what he's doing in order to offend and to desecrate the city of Jerusalem. However, there was one group of men called the Maccabees. You may have heard of them. The Maccabees. The Maccabees are a collection of brothers, a father and a collection of brothers. The most famous, of course, Judas Maccabeus, who then lead an army to attack Antiochus and to restore the temple. And so they say, whoever is faithful to the Torah and to the covenant, flee to the hills, flee to the mountains. And that's where we'll gather up our forces, who then go back and fight against Antiochus. And they win. They're able to establish a degree of national sovereignty from 164 BC through 63 BC. So it's 100 years or so of Jewish national sovereignty when they're not being ruled by the foreigners. Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, anybody else. This is their time of freedom, right? And as the story goes, when Judas Maccabeus cleansed the temple and he relit the menorah, there wasn't enough oil for the menorah to burn more than one night. You know what the menorah is? The seven branched candle stand that's supposed to look like the tree of life, and it sits in the temple space. And it's always lit. It always has oil put into it so it can be lit. And they just didn't have enough oil. But he lit one anyway. And on the second night, it was still burning. And on the third night, it was still burning. So the menorah burns for 8 nights with only a little bit of oil, and they see this as a miracle from God. Evidence that God is for the Maccabees, and he wants them to rule over the people. And so they believe that they have this kind of Davidic authority, that God has given up on the house of David, and he will now lead Israel through the Maccabees. Because David and his sons is what got us into trouble in the first place. That's why Babylon came to conquer us. Because of the sons of Judah, the sons of David were unfaithful. But this many hundreds of years later, the Maccabees, they are faithful. And they have pushed out the foreign oppressor and have this verification from God himself that he is supplanting the house of David with the house of Maccabees, or sometimes called the Hasmonean dynasty. So this is the same thing as the Hasmoneans. So when you see in the literature the Hasmoneans, that's the same thing as the Maccabees. Does this make sense? You can read all about this in the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Apocrypha. Now, here's the issue with these guys. In 142 BC, a guy named Jonathan Maccabeus is made the high priest. Now, this is a problem. Why is this a problem? Because now you have the king and the priesthood tied together, right? And this is, of course, a violation of the scriptural command that the sons of Levi, of the house of Aaron, right, should serve as the high priest. And this creates all kinds of divisions. From this moment right here is where you get tons of different groups that branch out in disagreement with what the Maccabees are doing. One is the Qumran Covenanters. This is the time when the Qumran settlement begins. These are the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is also the time when the Pharisees take on a unique role in Israel as teachers of the people in the land. And then, of course, you also have the Sadducees. We'll talk about them later. But the point is, this time of peace did not result in unity. It resulted in great disunity. It resulted in different groups within Israel, all with one question now: how can Israel continue? Right? So the Maccabees say, hey, everything's fine, don't worry about it. You just fall under our leadership. The Pharisees will say it's through law keeping. Qumran will say it's through holiness and by rejecting the Maccabees. And the Sadducees will say it's through the temple. We'll come back to all this in just a bit. But the point is, when in 63, okay. So in 63 BC, then the Romans take over. And they exert full control by 6 BC. So now the Romans have complete control of the land and complete control of Jerusalem. And they find themselves once again under foreign occupation, under foreign control, right? And so this question becomes all the more pertinent. How can Israel continue? Who are we? And what is our future? According to our sacred texts, what we now call the Old Testament, call it the Hebrew Bible, God has given us this land. And he's given us the Davidic monarchy to rule over us. He's given us sacrifices and law and temple here in this place. But there are many people who still live out in the exile. We call that the diaspora. people of the diaspora, people who still live far away from home. And the Romans control us. So there's some Jews who don't live at home. The Romans control those who do live at home. And some people think that the temple is totally corrupt. Totally corrupt. Temples were also banks in the first century world. They had a lot of money because people will always bring in their offerings. People will always bring in their sacrifices. And so when somebody wanted a loan, they could go to the bank, right? Well, the banking authorities in Jerusalem, the temple authorities, the Sadducees, were viewed as corrupt because if let's say one year you didn't have a good crop on your farm, you didn't have a good yield, you'd go to the temple and say, hey, I need a loan to get through this year. And they'll say, fine, we'll give you a loan, but as collateral, you have to offer your land. Do you know what I mean by that? So if you don't pay back the loan, we'll take your land. And they would put the interest rate so high that there's no way anybody could pay back the loan. And so the temple was just gobbling up land all over the place to have under their authority. And then what used to be your land, you're now a tenant farmer, and you have to pay taxes and a fee on your own land to the temple. Does that make sense? And so the temple is viewed as corrupt, and that's one of the problems Jesus has with the temple when he will arrive there in his last week. But here's the point. The Romans are in control. There are still people out in the diaspora. The temple is corrupt, which is why the Qumran covenant even got started. So there are all these problems with Israel, which just re-emphasizes this question right here. How in the world can Israel continue as God's people? Here are the answers people give. So if you're following in the outline now, I'm jumping down to Roman numeral 4 on lesson 3. The first group was the Sadducees. The first group was the Sadducees. And their answer was, Israel is just fine because we have our temple. This is what matters the most. The high water mark of the Old Testament was when Solomon built the temple. And the Babylonians destroyed it, but we've rebuilt it. And so Israel is in good shape because we have our temple. As long as we have our temple, we'll be fine. And when you know it, we control the temple. So the Sadducees believe the temple is the locus of Israel's identity, and that would put them in a position of what? Leadership. The second group of people are the Essenes. The Essenes. The Essenes are most likely the people who live at Qumran. You've heard of the Qumran Covenanters? Or the settlement called Kibbutz Qumran? Have you heard of that? Okay, so what this was a settlement out in the desert away from Jerusalem. It got started in 142 BC because probably a priest in office at the time was disagreeing with Jonathan Maccabeus being made high priest. And so he gathered up a bunch of people who thought that this was wicked and went out into the desert. Why do you think they went out into the desert? Why would the desert be a good place to start this rebel community? Okay, so if God brings judgment to Jerusalem, I think there's something to that, because they believe that God would act on the temple. He would either destroy it or cleanse it, and then they would come in and take over. Okay, good. So that's probably 3 reasons. So that's one of them. What are some other reasons, do you think? One is they just had nowhere else to go. You go to the best place you can. The other one is, how is the desert understood in the Jewish scriptures? Sorry? Coming out of Egypt and coming into the land. The desert is the place where Israel is born. The desert is the place where God picks them up, leads them through the desert, out of Egypt, through the desert, and the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so forth, describe a day when, and Amos, after the exile, what will happen? The Jews will come back across the desert. So coming through the desert basically means a reboot for Israel. So the Essenes basically are saying, what do we need? We need a second Exodus. We need a second Exodus. And they believe they're kind of going into the place where that's going to happen. But there were also Essenes in the towns. Not everybody could go live off in this settlement, in this difficult place, and just leave their families behind. So the Essenes were, you can find the Dead Sea Scrolls, parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls elsewhere in other places. So there's reason to believe that the Qumran Covenanters who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls did not keep that view to themselves, but spread it throughout the land. Again, how can Israel continue? One, we're doing just fine because we have the temple. Number two, we need a second Exodus. The Essenes, that's their argument. The third group is the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are known for what? What are the Pharisees known for? What? The law. Very good. The law. The Pharisees are saying, listen, what makes Israel Israel? The fact that we have the law. We are unlike anybody else in all the earth. We have the Ten Commandments. We know what is right. We know morality. And the reason we got in this problem in the first place is what? Not keeping the law. So if we can keep the law, we will, this is a little crass, but I think this is a summary way of saying it, we will force God to work for us. If we keep the law enough, God will act on our behalf. He will interpose, he will out the Romans, and we will be the good Jewish law-keeping society once again, just as Moses commended us to be originally. So the Pharisees actually, again, these are views spreading throughout the land, different views of how Israel can continue. The Pharisees were actually pretty popular because the Sadducees, again, were viewed as corrupt. The Essenes may or may not have been viewed as a little extreme. We can't all just go to the desert and act like Joshua again. You follow me? But the Pharisees, they actually went town to town. They would actually come to your synagogue and teach and say, you know, God will bless us once again if we keep the law, and point you to the book of Deuteronomy, and it'd be hard to disagree. Say, oh yeah, that's probably true. Great. Okay. Number 4, we have the Zealots. The Zealots. The Zealots, who are they? Anybody know? Yes, they're the fighters. Exactly. Let's all just remember, the way we took this land originally is because Joshua didn't just go to the desert and wait. He fought. He fought. And if we can sort of draw Rome into a war, God will bless us. These zealots, it's understood, would have, I'm going to try to say cloaks. They'd have cloaks with daggers inside of them, and they would walk around with these daggers. And if they were in a crowded marketplace, if they were close to a Roman guard, they would stab the Roman guard and try to kind of get away into the crowd. And so they were known as kind of terrorists, provoking the Romans to fight, right? And they would try to gin up as many followers as they could. Now, in Jesus' day, I mean, remember, Jesus' ministry is very brief. It's only 3 years, right? So we don't really see a lot. But before Jesus, more than once, actually, the zealots gain enough following that they gather an army together to fight against Rome. And in 70 AD, that's exactly what was going on there, too. The reason the Romans came down to destroy the temple is because the zealots were fighting. That was called the Jewish War from 66 to 70 AD. In 140-something AD, so after Christ, I think it was 140, it might be 130, there was another group led by a guy named Jesus Bar Kokhba, and he also led a group of zealots. And so the Jews were always the zealots were always growing and shrinking in their numbers and in their influence. And of course, their big thing is the land. We have to take the land back, right? The Herodians. We don't know much about the Herodians. They're in Mark briefly. They're probably people who just want to fall in line with the Romans, following the name of Herod. So their answer is just give up, right? What's up with all this old religious stuff? Let's just be part of the new world, the Greeks and the Romans, and make some money and go to the gymnasium and be part of the new world order and so forth. But the biggest group is the people of the land. Haaretz, which means people of the land. Haaretz. Means people. Haaretz means the land. The people of the land. Most people are in this group. This is simply your working poor. These are your landowners. These are your everyday people who don't have time or luxury to get involved in all these debates. You understand? And so this is how Israel is divided amongst the different people, different Jewish people, when Jesus is born. We should not imagine first century Judaism as this monolithic, simply one group of people with one set of understandings. Okay? They all have different views of what's important, what is good. Sadducees say that the temple is good. What is corrupt? Qumran says the temple is corrupt. What is the role of the law? What is the role of our history? And what can we expect? Now, here's what all four of these guys have in common. Temple, second Exodus, law, and land, if those are the emphases, they're all eschatological. Now, what does that mean? What does eschatological mean? It means that there's a specific moment in history that God has ordained that when we reach that moment, when we reach that horizon, a new world will begin. It will be like the new Garden of Eden. There will be a new temple. There will be a new righteousness and following of the law. There will be a new group of people. In fact, the problem with the Gentiles, where are the Gentiles? Here they are. All these bad guys who started the problems in the first place, including the Romans, right, will then come and join Israel in our worship. That's what falls on the other side of this great eschatological horizon. And an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and maybe, just maybe, the resurrection of the house of David. You follow me? Now, let me just pause right here for questions about these 6 different groups that Jesus will encounter in his ministry. Okay, good. Let me answer first the Septuagint. Yeah, so the Septuagint was written 2nd century BC, mostly in Egypt, in order to serve Greek-speaking Jews out in the diaspora. So remember the diaspora? The diaspora is the collection of Jews who never came home from the exile. And now we're talking, we're 400 to 500 years on from the time of Babylon. They're not coming back. They've got homes, they've got communities, they've got synagogues, they've got a new language, new culture and customs. They're probably not coming back, right? And they've lost, many of them have lost their understanding of Hebrew because it's very hard to transmit a language to the next generation of children when you're living in a land that speaks something else, right? So the Septuagint, sometimes abbreviated like this, which is your Roman numeral for 70, was a Greek translation of the Jewish Bible to serve those people. How did it affect their identity? It is interesting that ideas of exile are heightened in the Septuagint because the translators wanted the readers not to feel comfortable out in those lands. In other words, if you live in Bithynia, if you live in Rome, if you live in Egypt, if you live, in Persia or whatever, you should not be content. You should want to come home. God's purpose is that all the Jews would come home to that land. And so I think the Septuagint furthers this idea that even after Babylon, there's an ongoing exile. Does that make sense? Even though Ezra and Nehemiah have brought people back to the land, nonetheless, the exile is still going. And then in terms of identity, that's what I'm trying to get at right here with this. Their identity is either in the temple or in the hopes for a second Exodus or in the law or in the land, or they just want to give up and let's just become Greek and Romans. Let's just blend in with the rest of the world. but most people are just trying to get by. But these are the debates that are happening all around them. And the hope is, in one way or another, God will act in a magnificent eschatological way. The Sadducees probably didn't think that. The Sadducees probably thought, oh, we've arrived. We've got everything we need in the temple. But all the other groups think that they are going to experience a great eschatological inbreaking of God because they're still in exile. Even though they live in the land, if they're controlled by Romans and some people don't live in the land, we're all still in exile. Either all Israel's come back or we all haven't. Does that make sense? So the principal identity is we are still in exile. And then hope is placed in one of these things to make it happen. Does that make sense? No, that's a good question. He asked, do the tribes affect where they land in these 6 groups? No, not really. If you're part of the house of Levi, you're probably more inclined up in here. So in that case, yes. But the other ones could be anybody. But I want to emphasize, though, that even before Babylon took the Jews from the south, you probably know that the Assyrians took the 10 northern tribes up that would call it Israel, right? And those tribes are probably lost. And so even the name Jew means what? Of Judah. So most of these people are of the tribe of Judah. Though some of the Sadducees may have, I don't know about this, they may have claimed some identity with the house of Levi. So, but like Dan and Reuben and so forth, yeah, they're all long gone. Their identity, like I don't think many of them knew. So the Assyrians dealt pretty brutally with the northern kingdom. Whereas the Babylonians, they allowed the Jewish tribe, which we now call the Jews, to come to Babylon and live by themselves, practice their own religion to a degree, right? You got stories like Daniel, but largely they could stick together. And therefore, when Cyrus issued the edict, you can go home now, they knew exactly who they were. We're the tribe of Judah, and we're going home, right? Whereas the other 10 tribes were more brutally oppressed. And not only that, when the northern tribes were taken away, the Assyrians brought other nations and settled them in those northern territories, which is where you get the Samaritans, right? So the Samaritans are viewed by the Jews as half Israeli, half pagan, right? And so the only true descendants of the original tribes would be the house of Judah, and that's why we call them the Jews. That may be debated, that may be controversial, I don't know, but that's where the name the Jews comes from. But to your question, no, these were not largely along tribal lines. These are ideological. Great question. Did you have a question too, Shak? Yes, thank you. Did you say with the Pharisees? No, they're with the Pharisees.
But they work in the temple?
Well, there's, give me a second here. What's the group, the group that ruled Jerusalem? The Sanhedrin, thank you. So the Sanhedrin is made up of Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes. And so they work together in certain ways. But a scribe is, I think, more specifically a subset of Pharisees. Because what are they interested in? The law, and writing it, and keeping it preserved. So they write it down. Good question. There was another one? Yep. Right. It sure seems that they do have a mark of asceticism because they're living in the desert after all, right? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, people got really excited about what this would reveal for us. And so in that enthusiasm, a lot of hypotheses just popped up all over the place, right? One of them was that John the Baptist was at Qumran and he left in good terms, bad terms, we don't know. And that's where he got some of his camel hair and locust eating kind of stuff. I think what's important for us is, and we'll see this later today, is more important is the Elijah background than necessarily was he part of Qumran. Because remember, the Qumran Covenanters were not the only ones living in the desert. They weren't the only ones living out there. But John the Baptist himself is from a priestly family, isn't he, in the city. And so, yeah, maybe like a lot of priests, he had a dispute and went out and joined Qumran, or maybe not. I don't think we really know. It's intriguing, but I don't think there's no evidence to really tell. Okay, let me wrap this up. Okay, go ahead, Gemetchis, and then I'll bring it to a conclusion. Not so much. So the Old Testament itself has a mixed vision for the Gentiles. One, that they'll be destroyed at the coming of the day of the Lord. The other is that if they survive the day of the Lord, they'll join Israel in the true worship of the one God. How can it be both? Well, we'll sort that out later. But what that means is you have two visions of the Gentiles, and these different groups can pick which one they want to align with. Nearly all of them aligned with the first one. That Gentiles can come and worship if they want, but they have to keep a certain distance. So there was a wall out around I don't know how well you can see that picture in your handout. There was a wall all the way out around the temple precincts beyond which Gentiles could not come, even if they were circumcised, right? So the basic attitude is, you're the problem. You, in the form of Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, or whatever, are the problem of the world. And they do not have a good relationship. And they do not expect that on the other side of this eschatological horizon, Gentiles will join them. However, the Old Testament does. So what that means is these groups are ignoring a critical point of the Old Testament. The New Testament will sort that out in a far more consistent way. Does that help? Yeah, that's a good question. One more question. Did they have a vision of Messiah? Yeah. That predates Second Temple period. Yeah, that predates that. During the Second Temple period, because you have so many different groups, and we didn't even talk about the texts that they create, the Apocrypha, the Pseudepigrapha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, so many different expectations are written down about what they expect at that eschatological moment. They see the Messiah's role in different ways. So in the Psalms of Solomon, the author there predicts that the Messiah will come and cleanse Jerusalem and destroy all the Romans, right? At Qumran, they expect two Messiahs, a military Messiah and a priestly Messiah, right? So they have all these different views. They've taken bits of the Old Testament vision and reinterpreted them to suit their purposes as they wanted it. Does that make sense? So here's what I want you to do for the last 10 minutes. I want you to imagine a conversation in the first century, and you have these people, each of these are people or chairs, they're chairs, okay? Sitting around the table, and they're having a debate. What is their debate? Their debate is, how can Israel continue? How can Israel continue? Or to put it another way, who are we? Or to put it another way, what's going on? Or to put it another way, what's wrong with the world? How can we be under Roman rule the way we are, and whereas the Old Testament has this great vision of Israel as the head of the nations, right? And the Pharisees sit down at the table and say, I'll tell you what's wrong with the world. What's wrong with the world is we're not going to keep the law. So therefore, if we keep the law, God will lead us back from exile. They'll lead us back from exile. God will lead us back because our law-keeping sent us into exile. If we keep the law, that will bring us back from exile. You follow me? Okay. Then you have the Qumran Covenanters who sit down at the table and they say, no. Israel needs a complete restart. And just as Israel is born in the desert, so Israel needs to be reborn in the desert. And there will be a second Exodus, just as the prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel foretell. The end of the exile will be a new Exodus. So we're both solving the same problem, Pharisee and Qumran Covenanter, but in a different way. You follow me? The Essenes say we need to fight. The Sadducees say, look, everything's fine. Israel is all about the temple, and we have our temple, and so on and so forth. Okay? Who did I leave out? Oh, the Zealots. No, I'm sorry. These guys are the same. Sorry, these guys are the same. The Zealots are the ones who say, let's fight. Okay? No, I left somebody out. The Herodians, exactly. The Herodians, their basic point is, look, this is a silly question. Don't worry about it. Let's just make our money by blending in with the Romans. Okay? Then along comes Jesus. Then along come the apostles who write down Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What are Matthew, Mark, and Luke about? The continuation of Israel. What's wrong with the world? What's wrong with the people of God? How did we get in this mess? And what is the solution? And so the Christians, the early first century Christian movement can be seen as the apostles sitting down at the table to engage in this debate that's already going on with an answer to how God leads us out of exile. Because what the Christians say is, each of you has something right, but you also all have something wrong. The Pharisees, you're right. It is all about law. God gave us a law. He expects us to keep it. You are right. Qumran Covenanters and the Essenes, you're right. It is about a second Exodus. That is exactly what the prophets foretold. Israel is created as God's people in the first Exodus. They'll be recreated in the new Exodus, the Isaianic new Exodus. The Sadducees, you are absolutely right. The temple is huge. The building of Solomon's temple is the apex of Israel's history. It is everything, really, ever since the Garden of Eden, let alone the altars that Abraham built in the land, the tabernacle that was built, coming into the land and taking Jerusalem. All of that is driving towards the temple. And the principal problem in the Exodus is, the exile, is one, we were deported, yes, but also they destroyed our temple. So temple is huge, okay? And the Zealots, they want the land. Yes, absolutely, the land is important. God promised Abraham the land. And as long as we don't control the land and people are not in the land, we need, again, a second Exodus to get back into the land. So all of these are important. And so therefore, you all see something of the problem. But here's what Christianity is able to do. There's one thing that's left out of the conversation altogether. There's one point that no one has mentioned. I mentioned it once, but I didn't mean to. Does anybody know? When it comes to who is Israel in the Old Testament, what is another critical point? It's the house of David. In Genesis 3:15, I think you know this, the seed of the woman will step on the seed of the serpent, right? The rest of the rest of Genesis is all about tracing that seed until you get to what? Genesis 49, where who is identified as the seed? Judah. Judah, you will have your hand on the neck of your enemies. The hand on the neck of the enemies is the same thing as the foot on the head of the one with enmity. Do you understand? So clearly, by the time you get to the end of the book of Genesis, Judah is the tribe through which God will lead all humanity back into the Garden of Eden. The mess that the serpent created will be redressed, will be solved through the tribe of Judah. And that's why it's critical. You have someone in your church named, I forgot his name, Bezalel. And he was the principal architect of the tabernacle. What's important is that he's of the tribe of Judah, right? The tabernacle is this recreation of the Garden of Eden by the tribe of Judah. And Solomon is what? The great son of David, who's a son of Judah. Building the temple is a recreation of the Garden of Eden, an architectural Eden on earth where the high priest, through a sacrifice, is able to come back into the presence of God, receive forgiveness, and bring that forgiveness back to the people. Do you understand? And so the tribe of Judah, principally through the house of David, is absolutely imperative. And if you look in Isaiah, the son that is born is from the house of David, right? Ezekiel calls David my prince who will lead them back from exile. Amos has something on the rebuilding of the booth of David after it's fallen down. So while all of these groups have something critical to contribute to understanding who Israel is, they make the mistake of isolating them all and forgetting about the house of David. This is the power of first century Christianity. The Christians come along and say, actually, it's all of these things. It's all of these things that mark Israel. And guess what? We have the great Son of David sitting on David's throne right now by virtue of the resurrection. When Jesus was raised, he was placed on David's eternal throne to rule Israel and the nations. That was the promise to Judah in Genesis 49, that to you the obedience of all the peoples will come. You'll rule over your brethren and all the peoples. And so when Jesus was raised from the dead, he ascended to David's throne. And the kingdom that was promised to David in 2 Samuel 7, that you will have a kingdom forever and that your son will build my temple, is now coming to pass. Because David is building a new temple. That temple is an organic temple. It's not made of bricks and mortar. It's not made of stone. It's made of what? Flesh and bones. And it doesn't stay in one place in Jerusalem so that others can come to it. It spreads out of Jerusalem. It's organic and grows up all over the whole world. In fact, that's what the prophets foresaw. A mountain so big that it just keeps growing to overwhelm the whole world. And the Christians are saying, that's the people of God, spreading out all over the Greco-Roman Empire. It's this David who has led a second Exodus because he too is the new eschatological Passover lamb. The key to the Exodus is the Passover. The Passover lamb is the funnel through which everything has to pass, which means the new Exodus will have a new suffering servant, a new lamb who will die to inaugurate the great second Exodus. He himself perfectly kept the law and gives his Holy Spirit to his people to enable them also, not perfectly, but better than before, to keep the law. And finally, the land, brothers and sisters, is now the whole earth. You can have your dusty little land in Palestine. We're taking the whole globe. Right? Paul even says in Romans 4 that Abraham was promised the world. Where did he get that? He was promised the land. Well, Paul understood that the land was just a type, a momentary portion of the larger whole that it was always intended to point to. And all of this is effected through the cross and resurrection of the great Son of David. That's the one point of conversation that's not up here, and it's the one thing that binds all the rest together. That's the first century Christian message. And what we're going to see as we dive into the Gospels is we're going to see all of these problems of ongoing exile, of different groups contending for these different parts, and why Jesus, as the Son of David, is able to bind them all together, thereby completing God's purposes for the ages. And so what that means is when we talk about eschatology, we're not talking about, the return of Jesus. We're talking about the first coming of Jesus. God's coming into history to begin the process of all the things the Old Testament prophets are expecting for the world. And what this does, in turn, is it gives the Christian church a really strong identity. Who are you? We are the subjects of the Son of David, which God has been preparing, not since 2 Samuel 7, not since Genesis 49, since Genesis 3. And we are now his great eschatological people, re-entering into the presence of God, qua the temple that is his people. Okay, that was a lot. That was fast. And we, of course, revisit all these themes as we go. Let's take a moment right now and see if there are 2 or 3 questions. Maybe. Well, there are no dispensationalists at the table because they came along in the 19th century. Well, dispensationalists would say, that the plan for Israel is now put on pause, and we'll come back to it later. But, I just got to be honest. I'm not trying to make enemies, but there's just absolutely no sense of that. In the New Testament, it's clear that the word is fulfilled, which means whatever expectations there were for X, Y, and Z have now met their purpose. not put on pause. I mean, you really can't find any kind of pausing. Yeah, and again, I'm not trying to make any enemies, but 2 or 3 more generations and dispensationalism will be remembered as this historical curiosity, because I just think, yeah, truth wins out ultimately, and dealing honestly with the text, I think, demonstrates this continuing fulfillment emphasis. Other questions? Yeah, one of them, Matthew, was a tax collector. So the tax collector's not up here, but a tax collector would have been like a Herodian. He's working for the Romans, and he's collecting money, right? And so it's interesting that Simon and Matthew, I'm just going to put Matthew in this kind of, they would have hated each other. Oh, they would have hated each other. Simon wanted to kill Matthew. I'm sure Simon and Matthew were told to walk on opposite sides of the road. you know what I mean? Others, most of them, however, are just Am ha'aretz, fishermen, tradesmen. John was probably educated in some way, and James. So they could have been somehow related to the temple class, but not quite Sadducees. I think Jesus himself would have been most identified as a Pharisee himself. I think when he came to town and started teaching, people say, oh, there's a Pharisee over there, right? Until his disputes with the Pharisees start to become clear that he's different. You know what I mean? But most of them are the people of the land. Yeah. But you're right. You got Matthew and you got Simon that would have made for some interesting dynamics there.